20 or 40 some years, he accepted this ultimate ontology for Thelema and used it as the basis of his understanding of everything within Thelema. So it's why it's a very important thing if we're going to be studying Thelema to get these philosophical things. And that's another point that I want to make to you all. A lot of people study Crowley and Crowley's work in a ceremonial sense, and that's good. But that's not all that's out there. Crowley was very, very philosophical in how he approached a lot of this material. And to understand this material, we really have to study the same philosophical things that he's done. And this is something that I see Thelemites not really approaching, which is kind of why I wanted to do this lecture. So I really encourage you all to take the time and do some basic reading. Crowley was hugely influenced by Nietzsche, Hegel, and many other philosophers, Kant and so forth. So I really encourage you to take the time and read a lot about philosophy, because if you don't, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff is not going to make sense. Okay, so let's get to the Kabbalistic map. Was that pretty straightforward? Basically, you have the duality on Malkuth and things like that. Now, I know earlier in this I was talking about the Holy Guardian Angel. In magic, Crowley says that only an idiot would build a system based on the ideas of the Holy Guardian Angel, and that he just took the term and kind of made it up, or actually took it from the Abramelin working, but it really meant nothing. And so what did he do? As an idiot, he turned around and built a system on it. So then, in Aleister Explains Everything, which was his original title for Magic Without Tears, yeah, that's what he was going to call it. He says that the Holy Guardian Angel is a separate being altogether. The confusing thing, and the thing that a lot of people point to, is that in Magic Without Tears, Crowley says that the Holy Guardian Angel is a separate being. And actually within the commentaries, he refers to the Holy Guardian Angel as being part of the self and as a separate being. At one point he says in here, for every step you take towards your Holy Guardian Angel, he takes 2 towards you. So it seems very confusing that at one sense he's talking about the Holy Guardian Angel as a separate person, and at the other sense that the Holy Guardian Angel is part of the self, or maybe the self-conscious. Or a subconscious. Well, what are we doing when we kind of make those distinctions? Yeah, we're being very dualistic. And ultimately, if you were in a non-dual frame of mind, there would actually be no distinction between the Holy Guardian Angel as part of the self and the Holy Guardian Angel as separate from the self. John?
Wouldn't the whole purpose of working a system like this be to experience dualism as much as you can in order to transcend it? Because transcending dualism prior to a thorough understanding of it will only lead to madness, I think. A sudden understanding of everything that the universe is by somebody who has no intent on doing that could, in my mind...
you don't go from Malkuth to Kether by a blink of the eye.
Right.
It's a staged process.
And part of that process is to thoroughly explore your aspect of dualism, the dualism where you are, so that you're
going to explore dualism just by getting up in the morning. So,
but that can be argued that if all you're doing is getting up in the morning, that you're not really exploring it, or you're only half-heartedly.
If you look at the way Crowley's program is going, yes, in the early stages, you're dealing with understanding the illusion of dualism. But there's no reveling in the dualism, because you're ultimately reveling in an illusion.
Well, I don't mean reveling. In fact, reveling in it would almost be
contrary to what you want to do.
Rejecting it and being just part of the world and existing in it.
Right. So ultimately, your goal is to see duality for what it is, and maybe that's your point.
Yeah.
But it's to understand it at a fundamental level, and that's the really important thing. We all may leave here today, and we all may accept, oh yes, the world is non-dual, and that's the way it is, and we all just see duality as conventional. I'm an epsisimist, right? No. What you're trying to get to is a fundamental understanding of these things at the the deepest core of your being, that when you experience everything, when you look at everything, when you think about everything, you think about it in a non-dual way. And the Buddhists talk about this. Earlier, I was quoting Crowley when he was saying, what was it? It's like an annihilation. And once it happens, it happens, and there's nothing you can do about it, and there's no way to describe it. The Buddhists say it's like blowing out a flame. Once the flame is blown out, it doesn't come back. Once the duality of your core perception is gone, it's gone, and it doesn't come back. And there's millions of people over time who have tried to get to that point, and very few do. So it's not an easy thing to get.
And the description of the Epsissimus earlier, there was no denial of duality.
Oh, actually there was.
No, there was no denial of duality. There was the making no difference between one thing and another, not necessarily not recognizing that one thing is one thing and one thing is another, but that you neither construct nor block necessity.
That's correct. But what you're missing is the fact that when the Epsissimus has no relation with any being, he has no will in any direction, or no consciousness of any kind involving duality. His consciousness has ceased to work on the premises that are dual binding, such as distance, time. These things don't exist. They are conventions that the mind makes to differentiate things. For instance, if there is no time, we wouldn't know when to start and when to stop.
Does that necessarily mean that you are, while having a consciousness that includes all things, you do not have the consciousness of this mind that conceives of duality?
The way that it has been explained, because I certainly don't claim to be in this state myself, the way it has been explained is that you understand everything that's around you, and you still pick up a glass and drink, when you're hungry you eat, but your underlying consciousness and way of understanding existence around you is not based on dualism distinctions. Some of this is really hard to explain, simply as, no words can describe this final destruction. It's certain levels of understanding that I myself can only quote the people who claim to have gotten it, because I'm not there.
To attain that state, and yet have theoretical connection with a creature that's living here, then you pretty much have to train that creature really well in its automatic behaviors so that it doesn't die while you're not allowing it to be where it needs to be.
No, you're completely misunderstanding this. There's no rejection of the world around you. There's no, denial of, that if there's a dog right there, that there's a dog right there. It's a fundamental understanding that the distinctions that you're making between you and the dog and, the ground that it's on and the air that we breathe is a form of convention, and you see it in a very different way. Dan?
Are you saying then that Epsissimus views the world around him and doesn't see himself as separate from the world or any other part separate? He realizes they're individual components. And I guess my big question, does an Epsissimus know he's an Epsissimus?
Well, that's a good question.
As one, then is he
Right.
united or do?
Right. Crowley at one point did claim to be an Epsissimus, and so did Akkad. So, does an Epsissimus to claim they're Epsissimus? Well, if you accept that Crowley was one and or Akkad was one, I don't know. That's something that an individual would have to judge for themselves, and others who interact with that person would have to judge
The reason
too.
I ask that is in Liber in the exercise, one of the first things he says is that the magician should seek to stop making a choice or discriminate between things. Simply, yeah.
Right.
Which gets tricky because the choice of comparing things is a very subtle thing. Even if you think you're not doing it, you're doing it.
Yes. No, and I would venture to guess a smart person who is an obsessionist would not go around claiming they're obsessionist.
It sounds to me like the state of being an obsessionist is very similar to the attainment of Mahamudra Yoga from Kashmiri Shaivites, which is very close. It's a Hindu form that's very close to Tibetan Buddhism. And Mahamudra is the great seal of yoga, which is the exact state you've been describing, which is the state of simultaneously being aware that your body is discrete from other things, but at the same time is completely in union, so that every single waking moment you're simultaneously aware of the dual and non-dual nature of the universe. And by being
I'm not familiar with that system, so I can't answer to that.
It sounds very similar. I've been studying a yoga called Yoga Spindakarika lately, and it seems very, very similar. Of course, nowhere near even thinking, but just But it seems very similar to that. It's Mahamudra Yoga is the yoga that's transcendental of the 8 limbs of yoga, or the Great Seal, which is where where you have obtained that state. And it seems to me from your expression of what the obsessionist is supposed to be, that would be the state of having obtained the sacred tremor is how it's called, where you're understanding, where you're able to move within the vibrational field is simultaneously dual and non-dual.
Okay. Alan?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. You mentioned something in passing that I think probably is very important. You said there would be certain things that one would sort of expect if one were in the presence of an obsessionist claimed or otherwise. As you're aware, I have a little list of people for the last 200 years that I would consider to be in that category.
Right. And so did Crowley.
Right. Well,
his list was a little different than yours.
Well,
there were definitely overlaps.
A considerable number of overlaps. Do you think that there would be something in the way of, I'm loath to use the term objective, scientific testing, whereby one would at least be able to assess that something seems to be in the direction that is attributed to existence? Similar to, at a lesser level, some of the testing that has been done with Buddhist monks in Japan, for example, showing objective changes in brain waves during meditation and so forth. Or is it something?
I don't know, and that ultimately is the answer. I don't know, but it would seem to me that consciousness cannot be measured, and that ultimately is the scientific method. Now, even what you're talking about there is where they're hooking up various equipment that can get the brainwave patterns and see heat centers and where blood is flowing within certain brain centers and things like that. And they've done experiments where Buddhist monks in certain samadhic states and nuns who are in deep prayer to God, they've looked at their brains, and the brains actually have the same sort of functioning, same areas that have blood, and they describe very similar aspects of feeling oneness with the universe and all of these different things. But then when you turn around and say, well, where did that come from? The nuns will say, well, that's from the grace of God, and the Buddhist monks will say, well, that's because I'm in certain states of conscious meditation. So there are physical aspects to it that are certainly measurable, that science is getting more and more capable of looking at and detecting. But the levels of consciousness, science has not been able to touch. And the closest thing it can do is various psychological practices. And even those end up getting closer to kind of, especially if you go into like cognitive behavioral and things like that, they're more about actions and habits and more of the animal side than the higher levels of consciousness. So would there be a way of testing that in a scientific illuminist way? I do not know.
Wouldn't the very act of trying to quantify it force it to the dualistic side?
Yes, in some degrees. Jung writes about in the limits of science that science can only measure things that